Welcome back to the Politics and Media Show. Many have welcomed government legislation to prevent forced marriages, but a number of charities have expressed concern that making forced marriage a crime could deter young victims from coming forward. The government wants to criminalise the practice because it believes that previous civil measures that were designed to stop forced marriages have failed. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has warned that those found responsible could expect tough sentences. But several charities have warned that victims will be less likely to report crimes because of the additional pressure that members of their family could end up in prison. Family law experts have also cast doubt on whether there is a need for a new crime to be created. Well, before I introduce tonight's guests, let's take a look at this report.
Forced marriages are to become a criminal offence in England and Wales, leaving parents who coerce their children into a marriage facing the prospect of prison. The announcement by British Prime Minister David Cameron and Home Secretary Theresa May of their intention to introduce legislation is light on detail, but it's expected that the existing civil remedy of forced marriage protection orders will continue to exist alongside the new criminal offence. Ministers also want to introduce criminal penalties for breaches of civil forced marriage protection orders, which can be used to prevent children being taken abroad to marry. But government critics say that the new measures will drive the problem underground and that it puts victims in a difficult position where they're being forced to testify against their own families. Other critics say the mere fact that victims of forced marriages are vulnerable implies they will be unlikely to even come forward. A leading lawyer on forced marriages voiced similar concerns, saying that laws already existed which would combat the problem of forced marriages.
The idea of criminalising forced marriage is very difficult. I personally, and as a practitioner, would not condone it. I do not support the idea of criminalising forced marriage. And I have a number of reasons for that. But I personally don't, within that consultation, believe it should be criminalised. Education and public awareness are very important, the most important resource we have to deal with the problem. There are two areas. There's the mainstream public, the wider society, were unaware of these issues, or if they were aware of them, it doesn't happen to us. It happens to them, those people. It happens in those communities which are not our communities, which was not helpful. And then the communities themselves would be saying, well, it doesn't happen in our communities. You know, don't pick on us because we don't have that. We don't do that. And of course, over the years, we have seen much more awareness happening, awareness programs happening within the communities, but it's got to be grassroots. And the idea that that could happen within a matter, I would say, of 1 or 2 years is ridiculous. It's going to take a long period of time.
Well, in the studio to discuss this with me is Anita Prem, founder and president of the Freedom Charity. We also have the author, Sophia Ahmed, who recently wrote the book Secrets of a Henna Girl. And on the phone we have Anjum Anwar of Muslim Women's Voices. Welcome to you all. Anita, it's hardly as if there isn't legislation that could already prevent, or should already prevent, forced marriages. So what's so good about having another piece of legislation on this issue?
Well, we do have civil action that can be taken if parents force their children into marriage, but it's obviously not enough and it's not working. It's not giving young people protection against forced marriage. I mean, at the moment there's between 5,000 to 8,000 cases that are reported of forced marriage every year. And I think we really need to be clear what a forced marriage is. It's a young person being forced to marry against their will. And what that leads is to domestic abuse. It leads to abduction, kidnapping, serial rape, and in some cases, in the most extreme cases, murder. Young people need to be protected against all of those things.
So, Sophia, nobody obviously could possibly justify that, but do you have some reservations about whether or not this is the right way to deal with it?
I welcome the legislation. I think society needs to send out that message that it's something that is unacceptable. But my reservations come in where I hope that the government doesn't think that it's okay, that they've ticked a box and that's it, and they're just going to, you know, they don't have to do anything else. I think the problem is about education, and I think prevention is something that we should work towards more than prosecution.
Anjuman, let me just bring you in. Thank you for joining us on the phone. Do you think that this legislation will be counterproductive in the sense that, as some people have suggested, it will push people into not reporting it because of the fear of prison for people that they know or people in their families?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum. Can we really legislate people's thinking? That's a worrying sign, because I don't believe that one can legislate people's thinking. If that had been the case, then we would not have had 80,000 racial bullying reported in schools throughout the United Kingdom. What I'm saying is legislation can only be a safety net. It has to be education, and your earlier, the lady who's a solicitor was talking about, it has to be education. It has to come from the communities who are actually facing this problem. As a Muslim, if this is happening in a Muslim household, then the leadership needs to stand up and ask the difficult question, why is this happening? What can we do? Why do we always need external bodies to dictate what can be done and what can't be done? Tomorrow, we will be talking about same-sex marriages. The question I'm asking is that legislation alone will become a hindrance. We need education, and we need the people who are suffering within their communities to stand up and ask the difficult question why this is happening.
I mean, Anita, I mean, you're in favour of the legislation, but presumably you would agree that legislation criminalising this kind of issue is a last resort, that the educational aspect that people have been talking about is fundamental.
Absolutely. I mean, as a charity, we were founded, you know, the main aim was to deal with prevention of forced marriage. We go into schools most days, and I'm delivering the book, But It's Not Fair, that I wrote, and it's being supported by the government. It's a piece of fiction, and every single school that we've been into, there's been at least one person come up to us that they or their friend has been about to be forced into a marriage. So it's a huge problem. And the government have announced, I was with the Prime Minister on Friday when he announced criminalisation of forced marriage, and there is going to be a package of support and education that's going to be put into every school in the UK to ensure that the education is actually there. And that's really crucial. It's not just lip service, it's ensuring young people are protected and they know what their rights are.
How do you think the legislation will be able to distinguish between something which is forced, i.e. presumably does not have the consent of the couple at the heart of the question, and more subtle pressures which exist in all communities, you know, to do with class and to do with status and parental authority and so forth?
Well, there's a huge difference between an arranged and a forced marriage, and I think often people from the outside are thinking, well, the government and the courts and the criminal justice system are not going to understand the difference. I think they're very clear about the difference. An arranged marriage is with consent, where parents, family are introducing you to someone they feel suitable, and you have the absolute right to say no. A forced marriage is where one or both parties do not have that choice. They are forced into this, and it leads to horrendous crimes. You know, suicide rate amongst Asian girls are 3 times higher than any other group in the UK. And a number of the reasons, well, one of the key reasons is being forced into marriage and the amount of pressure it puts on them. They don't want to go against what their parents say, but they have basic human rights that need to be adhered to.
Do you think, Safia, do you think that whether you're for or against the legislation, that one of the ways that it may be used in the current political environment is a kind of Muslim bashing piece of legislation, even though actually its provisions will apply to any or a number of other communities?
You mean in the media? I think that's going to happen. You know, well, I think is it 46% of the cases that the forced marriage units have recorded are from children of Pakistani heritage. You can't deny that it's a problem, majority within the Muslim community. The newspapers aren't going to make it clear that this is a cultural issue, not a religious issue. I think it's up to the community to stand up and say, this is not something that our religion permits. You know, the majority voices who would completely disagree with it. It happens, although it's a cultural problem, it happens in a minority of families. It's not across, you know, the entire community, as newspapers might try to show.
Anwar, is that part of your concern, the way in which we might say ideologically the legislation will be presented?
Yes, absolutely, and I think the lady who just spoke is quite right, that it is happening in those communities, and those communities have to stand up. And I find that the leadership now needs to come out of the comfort zone and ask the question. And there are ways that can be done when somebody is getting married. I think the imam needs to ask the questions when he feels that there may be something uncomfortable. And I don't understand why we shy away from asking these difficult questions. When will we stand up and resolve our own problems? Why do we always have to be looking outside? And one of the issues is that, yes, it does happen in a Pakistani situation. Yes, it does happen in the Indian and the Bangladeshi communities. But the problem is that maybe it's because majority of the cases are females. And maybe our leadership is male. I don't know. All I know is that unless difficult questions are asked, we're not going to resolve this problem. Legislation alone will not resolve this situation.
Can I just come in on something? We talked about education. The reasons I have concerns about this legislation is because we've had forced marriage orders in place since about, I think, 2007, where a potential victim, can apply for an order to be placed against their parents, so they're not taken abroad and they don't have the marriage here. Now, if that order is breached, then you can, when the legislation comes in, that's when they can get arrested and charged and so forth. Now, the problem is that majority of the kids out there in the UK and the schools and the teachers aren't aware that this civil law, this forced marriage order exists. And the reason for that is because the schools just haven't promoted it. The Forced Marriage Unit in the Foreign and Home Office do excellent work, but the Department of Education has done absolutely nothing to back up their work. And you mentioned, Anita, that David Cameron has given commitment that these school packs will go out. But, are the schools really going to put up the posters and the leaflets, or are they going to be afraid of being accused of racism by their majority parents that are in that community?
I think we have to make this. This is certainly not just an Islamic Muslim issue at all. It happens within the travelling communities. It happens much wider. And so the government isn't looking at it in just that particular vein. In terms of educations and schools, I've had commitment from the ministers that the educational authorities are looking at the work that we are doing at Freedom Charity, and every school we have approached have welcomed us in. We have a list now of over 200 schools that want us to go in and deliver assemblies and lessons in the book, but it's not fair. So we're not finding any schools that are shying away from it. And these are very diverse communities, very diverse schools. We're finding the complete opposite, actually. Schools are welcoming all the literature and information now, and I think with the legislation it will only protect young people more.
Are you worried, though, that in a climate where Islamophobia is a fact of life in the way in which these things are reported, that whatever, even if we accepted that the government's intention here is entirely well meant, that in the media it will be treated differently?
I think that's a risk, but then I think the community needs to come forward very clearly, and when there are cases of young people being subjected to forced marriage, that within the community it's dealt with before it even happens, before it goes that way. But I think there needs to be counter media of all the positive things that happen within communities and all the positive steps that are taken. All the positive things, the community are on the moves that they're actually making themselves. And I think that can be reported wholeheartedly as well.
And do you think that this issue, this problem, do you think it's a problem which, however serious the level of it is at the moment, that it's a declining problem or a problem that's growing?
It's a problem that is growing. I agree with what your speakers are saying, but as a teacher myself, I have visited over 850 schools. A lot of political correctness, a lot of tick boxing. Yes, we've had somebody from outside who's discussed the difficult issues, and we've done our jobs. We need to be educating the parents, the mothers, the hard-to-reach communities, and the information that comes out from the pulpit on a Friday sermon at a mosque will make much more impact on communities, and no disrespect to the people who are going to schools at all. But these people will listen to the Friday sermon. That is not happening. All I'm saying is that this will increase unless we ask the difficult questions. That's when are we going to have our next khutbah, when the imam stands up and said, this is not acceptable, it's crime against humanity, our faith does not approve of this. Why should we, well, if these people are not listening to their own faith, why would they listen to some secular law? Will they have that understanding?
What's been happening with the orders that you referred to, Sophia? Are they implemented, or is this a kind of, if you like, a premonition of what might happen with this piece of legislation, that it exists as a possibility but isn't actually implemented?
The orders have been very, very successful, because once they're in place, you can't marry that child off, you can't take them abroad. The problem has been that people don't know about them enough. So, for example, an average 15-year-old who feels that she's at risk, she might be taken abroad. Now she'll think, because nobody's advertised them, the schools haven't put the posters out, nobody's gone into the schools to discuss them, all she will think is that if she raises her voice now, her parents are going to go to jail. None of the communication hasn't been done, and that's what I worry about, that they don't know about the forced marriage orders, that this is the first step, that these are the safety nets, and when it comes to the absolute extreme where the parents just don't listen and they say, no, you're going to get married, if they breach that forced marriage order, then the criminal side will come into it. But people aren't going to be aware of that.
Are you worried about that this will be a piece of window dressing legislation for the government, but not actually practically?
No, I don't actually. I think it's been made very clear that you're still going to have the civil side, the protection side on that, and this is just an added piece of armoury there to protect young people. I think we don't have anything to fear about it. I think the government have looked at it very sensibly and very sensitively, and they've done a wide consultation, and the majority of people, in every school we visited, I think 98% of all students we contacted wanted forced marriage to become a criminal offence. They were very clear. They were also aware about the protection orders that are available to them. But there needs to be another arm as well. We need to deal more with prevention and less about worrying about being politically correct and standing on eggshells. We need to be very clear that we're protecting young people, because when we're talking about forced marriage, we are talking about child abuse. Let's be very clear. That's what we're talking about.
And what do you think will be the impact on the victims here? Because that, in the end of the day, will be the acid test. Will it mean more people coming forward, or will it mean less people coming forward?
I think time will only tell. I've spoken to several people in the past few days, and people are apprehensive. Their loyalties will be divided, as we've said earlier. Do we put our parents in jail, or do we run away? What happens to our other siblings when the parents are behind bars? What happens to those other siblings? Who takes care of them? So these are the questions that will be burdened onto a young person. Who's going to look after that conversation? So I think we wait and we see.
For example, there's a charity called Refuge, and they did a survey with all their girls that they have, and every single one of them said that they would not have left their homes, walked away if that criminal law had been in place when they'd done so, because they're just terrified that exactly what Anjum said about that, what would happen to their families.
I mean, we have the same argument, this argument happened in the UK over 30 years ago when they talked about domestic violence becoming a criminal offence. And it hasn't deterred people. In fact, more and more people come forward that are in abusive relationships and testify against each other. We're talking about the most extreme cases. I'm often in family court and I see children having to give evidence against their parents. It's not something anyone would wish to happen. But if it's about protecting people, that's what we have to do. And there will be protection and everything else available and afforded to young people that are in immediate danger. That has to be the way forward.
So if this is a last resort in the way that you describe, and as you say, this only applies to will only apply in a minority of extreme cases where the person is willing to come forward. What is the rest of the what is the programme for the rest of, and therefore the majority of cases?
Well, the finite detail hasn't been gone into yet.
I don't mean so much just in the legislation. I mean outside this legislation.
Well, the governments are putting more money in there. Charities and government agencies are all geared up now to support people that come forward that say they're about to be forced into marriage, and all the same guidelines and all the same protection is still there. So you still will have refugees, you still will have sisters, you still will have all that protection available there, but it'll just be the final straw if it does come to that.
Anwar, what do you think? If this is a sort of last case, a most desperate case solution, or even if you, as you believe it's not, what else needs to happen?
I like to see more awareness, more conversation taking place with intra-dialogue within individual communities where this is happening. I would like to see more involvement through education, not only just schools, but I'm looking at informal education as well. And I think we need to educate mothers, the important part of women's voice, that we educate our mothers to say these are the things that can go wrong. And the question is, why do we have forced marriages in the 21st century? And those questions have to be asked rather than just putting icing on cake with a criminalization of a situation. We need to ask why this is happening.
Sophia, so what else? Even if this is the last case and it works the last case, what about all the other cases?
I think in the community needs to stand up and take responsibility through their mosques. I think a few months ago there was a visit throughout England of the Mufti of Kashmir. He was invited by the community, and he went around 5 cities: Bradford, Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham and London. And they held big rallies, and he stood up and he said, this is completely wrong, you can't be doing this. Now, the problem is, you know, forced marriages happen a lot in the Kashmiri community, so you've got the Mufti standing up. This is a cleric that they respect and listen to. But we've only had that one guy do it. I've never heard of any other case where clerics have stood up and said, you know, this is forbidden in Islam. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, you know, it's not a valid marriage if you force someone, if there's no consent. I think the community needs to do a lot more. The prevention will come from the community. And then if you still have those extreme cases where parents still go ahead with it, you know, despite it being forbidden in Islam, then fine, the criminal law can come in then. But before that, I think, you know, we need to do more in schools. We need the religious side to do more.
Okay, well, thanks very much. That brings us to the end of this week's programme. My thanks to my studio guests, and I hope that you'll be joining us again in the future for another edition of the Politics and Media programme.